Greetings, and welcome to Chaim's weekly podcast, recorded live in Richardson, Texas. We invite you now to join us for one of our synagogue's Shabbat messages.
Well, Shabbat Shalom. We are so glad to be able to be with you here today and worship with you and celebrate Purim with you. And so before we start, I have one quick announcement, or actually two quick announcements. The first is that about halfway through the book of Esther, there'll be a short pause. And don't panic. We didn't forget our lines. Haman didn't get us. We're all good. And we'll be back out in just a minute. Just some backstage stuff. And then the second thing is, it's not really a skit as much as it is just, it's God's Word. It's as word for word as we can. So I know this afternoon, I think you all are going to have a skit with audience participation, booing and cheering and all that. But if you could just hold that for this, we'd appreciate it. So as we've been studying this book together and memorizing it, we have just been amazed by the layers of messages and lessons that God has had for us. And, one of the most important for us was the fact that even though throughout the entire book you won't find a single mention of God's name, His presence is everywhere. And you see that in the life of Esther herself, because she is a symbol for Christ. She was called to sacrifice. She was called to save her people. And even though she didn't experience death, she definitely faced death in the circumstances she was in. And then in Mordecai, we see an example of our Heavenly Father. And we see that Esther obeyed Him in everything. And we see that His care and His love for her. And so the second thing is that, in the book of Esther, we see a lesson for our lives that even if our life circumstances are terrible, they're not what we chose. They're never how we would have imagined it. If we are obedient to God, He can use that, and He can do a mighty work in our lives. And for Esther, she would never have chosen the circumstances she was in, but she stayed obedient, and she trusted God, and He used her to save the entire Jewish nation. And the last thing is, for those of you here today that may not know our Lord Jesus Christ, Yeshua, and may not have His Spirit in your life, I would just encourage you, and I would pray that you would someday find Him, and you would let Him live in your life, and His Holy Spirit have a presence in your life and make a difference in your life. And for you kids down here out front, all the kids out there, and really for everybody, I want you to really be listening for the time when Esther obeys, even when she was in grave danger. Because with the way the world is today, that may very well be us before too long. We may have to make a choice to obey God, even if that puts us in danger. Now, it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. The Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and his attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of his provinces being in his presence. He displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. Now, when these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden at the king's palace. There were hangings of fine white and violet linen, held by cords of fine purple linen, on silver rings and marble columns. There was a couch of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of marble, porphyry, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds. The royal wine was plentiful, according to the king's bounty. Drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion. The king had given orders to each official in his house that he should do according to the desires of each person. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Biztha, Harbona, Mehuman, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring forth Queen Vashti with her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. The king became very angry. His wrath burned within him. And he said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king, so to speak before all those who knew law and justice and were close to him, Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom.
According to law, what is to be done about Queen Vashti? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus that was delivered to her by the eunuchs.
In the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the people and all the princes in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence. She didn't come. This day, the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes. There will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him. Let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Queen Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal position to another, who is more worthy than she. Now it shall come to pass, when the king's edict, which he shall make, is heard throughout his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. This word pleased the king and the princes. The king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the king's provinces, to every province according to his script, to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house and the one who speaks in the language of his own people.
After these events, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then all the king's servants who served him at the king's gate said to him, "Let beautiful young virgins be gathered to the king, and let the king appoint overseers in every province of the kingdom, and let them bring every beautiful young virgin to Susa, the capital, into the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young lady who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." Now, the matter pleased the king, and he did so accordingly. There was in Susa, the capital, a Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And he had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who were exiled when Jeconiah was king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. Now, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, because she had no father and mother. Now the young lady was beautiful in form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So, it came about when the command and decree of the king was given, and many young ladies were brought into the capital of Susa, into the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women, that Esther was taken to the king's palace, into the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women. Now, the young lady pleased him and found favor and kindness with him. So, he quickly provided her with food and with the cosmetics for the women, and he gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Now, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. And every day, Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to see how Esther was and how she fared. Now, when the turn of each young lady came to go into the king Ahasuerus, after the end of 12 months, according to the regulation of the women, for the days of their beautification were as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and the cosmetics for women. The young ladies would go into King Ahasuerus in this way. Anything she desired would be given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, into the custody of Shahashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, came to go into the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, had advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, to his palace, in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and found favor with him more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and servants, and made a great holiday throughout all the provinces, and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther did not yet make known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make them known. And Esther did what Mordecai told her, even as she had done while under her care. Now, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials from among those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he informed Queen Esther, and she told the king. And when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the Chronicles, in the presence of the king.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his testimony for all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, but he would not listen to them. So they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand. For they had told them who the people of for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage, he was filled with rage. Therefore, for he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. For they had told them who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman thought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, that is the month Nisan, year of King Ahasuerus, that is the lot cast upon Haman, day to day, month to month, until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus,
"There is a certain people scattered and dispersed from all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are not like the people's laws of other peoples, and do not follow the king's laws. It is not in the best interest of the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands who carry out the king's business, to be put in the king's treasuries."
Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. Then the king said to Haman,
"The silver is yours. The people also. Do with them as you wish."
Then the king's servants were summoned on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And it was written just as Haman had commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors of each province, to the princes of each people, each province according to its creed, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with his signet ring. And the letters were sent to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and annihilate all the Jews in one day on the 13th day of the 12th month. All the Jews, both young and old, women and children, and to seize the possession as plunder. A copy of each edict to be issued in law in every province to all the people, that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out, impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued through the capital. While the king and Haman sat down to drink their wine, the city of Susan was in confusion.
When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. He went out in the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish. She sent garments to Mordecai to clothe him, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from among the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to find out what this was and why it was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the midst of the city square in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him, and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews, and gave him a copy of the text of the edict that was sent out from Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her and order her to go into the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. Then Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. And Esther ordered Hathach to reply to Mordecai.
Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court, who has not been summoned, there is but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king hold out to him the golden scepter that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days.
Then Hathach related Esther's words to Mordecai, and Mordecai told him to reply to Esther.
Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this.
Then Esther told him to reply to Mordecai.
Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same manner. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish.
And they related Esther's words to Mordecai, and Mordecai went out and did just as Esther had commanded him.
Now it came about on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne opposite the entrance of the palace. And it happened, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. So Esther came near and touched the top of his scepter. And the king said,
"What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? For even up to half of my kingdom, it will be granted to you."
So Esther said,
If it please the king, may the king and Haman come this day to a banquet that I have prepared for him?
And the king said,
"Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires."
So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And as they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said,
"What is your petition, Queen Esther? For it will be granted to you. And what is your request? For even up to half of my kingdom, it will be done."
So Esther answered and said,
My petition and my request is, if I have found favor before the king, and if it please the king, may the king and Haman come to a banquet that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says.
Haman went out that day glad and pleased of the heart. But when he saw Mordecai sitting in the king's gate, neither stand up or tremble before him, he was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, went to his house and sent for all his friends and his wife Zeresh, and recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him over the princes and the servants of the king. And Haman also said,
Even as the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she has prepared. And tomorrow also, I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me. Every time I see Mordecai the Jew standing at the king's gates.
Then Zeresh's wife and all his friends said to him, have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. The advice pleased Haman, so he had a gallows made. During the night the king could not sleep, so he gave order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said,
"What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?"
Then the servants who were attending him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said,
"Who is in the court?"
Now Haman had just entered the outer court and demanded to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. And the king said,
"Let him come in."
So Haman came in, and the king said,
What shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?
Then Haman said to himself,
Who would the king delight to honor more than me?
And Haman said to the king,
For the man which the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, one which the king has worn, and a horse on whom the king is ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And take the horse and the robe, and hand it over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man which the king delights to honor, and parade him through the city square, saying, Thus shall be done for the man which the king delights to honor.
and the king said,
Take quickly the robe and the horse that you have said, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate.
So,
Fall short in anything of all that you have said.
So Haman took the robe and a horse and arrayed Mordecai through the city square, proclaiming before him, Thus shall be done for the man which the king delights to honor. Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his face covered. And recounted to Zeresh his wife and all his friends what had happened to him. Then Zeresh his wife and all his wise men said to him, If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you shall not overcome him, but surely fall before him. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared.
Then the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther, the queen. The king said to Esther also on the second day, as they drank their wine at the banquet,
What is your petition, Queen Esther? For it will be granted to you. And what is your request? For even up to half of the kingdom, it will be done.
Then Queen Esther answered and said,
If it pleases the king, and I have found favor before him, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. For if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not have been commensurate with the annoyance of the king.
Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther,
Who is he? And where is he? Who would presume to do thus?
and Esther said,
A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman.
Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Now the king arose in his anger from the place where they had been drinking and went out into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther because he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Now when the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said,
Would he even assault the queen when I am in the house?
As the words went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, Behold, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai the Jew, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said,
Hang him on it.
So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had made for Mordecai. And the king's anger subsided.
On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai, the Jew, came before the king, for she had disclosed what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and implored the king that he divert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot he devised against the Jews. The king extended his golden scepter, so she arose and stood. Then she said to the king,
If it pleases the king, and I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy all the Jews who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For how can I endure to see the calamity which shall befall my people? And how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?
Then King Ahasuerus spoke to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, and he said,
Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther. And now they have hanged him on the gallows because he stretched out his hand against the Jews. Now, you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name, and you seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be revoked.
So the king's scribes were called at that time, in the third month, that's the month Sivan, on the 23rd day. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded the Jews, the satraps, the governors, the princes of all the provinces that extended from India all the way to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all. To each province its own script, and to each people its own language, as well as the Jews, with their script and their language. On one day, in them, the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to kill, to destroy, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province who might attack them, including women and children, and to plunder their spoil. The couriers, hastened by the king's command, went out riding on royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel in Susa. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, a copy of the law to be issued as law in each and every province was published to the peoples, so that the Jews will be ready on this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Mordecai went out from the presence of the Jews in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold on his head, and garments of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews, there was light, gladness, joy, and honor. For in each and every province, in each and every city, wherever the king's command arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews. A feast and a holiday. And many of the peoples among the land became Jews, because the dread of the Jews had fallen upon them.
Now, in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day, on the day when the king's command and edict were to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, it turned on the contrary, so that the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in all their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. Even the princes of the provinces, the governors and the satraps, and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews, for the dread of Mordecai had fallen on all of them. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. The man Mordecai became greater and greater. Thus the Jews struck with the sword their enemies, killing and destroying. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmasta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now, on that day, the number of those that were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther,
"The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What more have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? For it will also be done. And what is your further request? For it will be done."
Then Esther said, "Let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa, to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th day of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day of that month, and made it a holiday for feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month Adar a holiday for feasting and rejoicing, and for sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. But the Jews who are in Susa make the 15th day of the month Adar a holiday for feasting and rejoicing. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month that turned them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, for feasting and rejoicing, and for sending portions of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, to cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and to destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by a letter that the wicked scheme which Haman had devised against the Jew should return on his own head, and that he and his 10 sons were to be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the name Pur. And because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them, that they should not fail to celebrate these 2 days, according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. These days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, nor their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. They sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these customs for Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and their descendants, with their times of fasting and their lamentations. The command of Queen Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. Now King Ahasuerus laid tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai. Are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai was second only to King Ahasuerus, and in favor with many of the Jews, and in favor with many of his kinsmen. One who sought the good of his nation, and spoke for the welfare of his entire people.
For more information, visit us at www.etzheim.org. That's spelled EITZ-CHAIM.org. Or join us in Richardson, Texas for our weekly Shabbat services.